Abdul al-Jaber war eigentlich für die Diskussion aus dem Kongresszentrum, ist dann ins Auto gesessen und direkt hierher gerast, um pünktlich zu sein. Abdul al-Jaber ist ein Mann aus der Wirtschaft. Er ist Vizevorsitzender und CEO der Paltel Group. Das ist ein Telekommunikationsunternehmen aus den palästinensischen Autonomiegebieten. Herzlich willkommen, Abdul al-Jaber. Ich begrüße aus Jerusalem Ulrike Wohlrab. Ulrike Wohlrab ist Pfarrerin. Sie betreut da unter anderem zum Beispiel Pilger, die nach Jerusalem kommen, und ist zuständig für die protestantische deutschsprachige Gemeinde in Jerusalem.
Also for the German-speaking community in Jerusalem, has been working there for 2.5 years. Welcome to you as well. I'd also like to thank from the Jewish community for relations, David Rosen. Welcome to you as well. We have Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to interrupt now the live transmission, and I'd introduce our participants, David Rosen,
Abdul al-Jaber war eigentlich im Publikum für
Abdul al-Jaber was in the the audience at the Congress Center. He got in a car and sped here to get here on time. He's a man from the business sector. He's the vice chair and CEO of the Paltel Group. It's a telecoms group from the Palestinian territories. Welcome, Abdul al-Jaber. From Jerusalem, allow me to introduce Ulrike Wohlrab, who is a priest representing pilgrims on the one hand, who comes to Jerusalem, and responsible also for the German-speaking community in Jerusalem, has been working there for 2.5 years. Welcome to you as well. I'd also like to thank from the Jewish community for relations, David Rosen. Welcome to you as well. We have followed the panel then in the Congress Center. The Turkish Prime Minister was very clear in his words. He said Hamas needs to be brought to the negotiating table. We also heard the Secretary General of the Arab League saying that the Palestinian community was almost being suffocated. Then we had the UN Secretary General who emphasized the humanitarian aspect and the isolation there. And we also heard the Israeli President Shimon Peres at the end, who underlined the right of Israel to self-defense. Many voices we've heard then. I would like them to link it with our discussions here. What did those comments give rise to? What was surprising? What perhaps gave rise to anger or agreement? I'll turn to Ulrike Wohlrab first. Well, first of all, I would say that I remained with the impression that everybody simply made their own position clear, but there wasn't really any genuine discussion. It doesn't seem that anybody is ready to breathe hope into this process and show themselves ready to compromise. I also thought it was interesting to see how visibly angered the Turkish Prime Minister was. It's patently clear how closely he's been impacted by what has been going on. And if that is the result of years of negotiations, you can see how hardened the positions are. Despite all of that and all of that understanding, I would have liked to see a bit more preparedness for compromise. David Rosen, what surprised you?
Well, nothing really surprised me, but I was greatly disappointed. And I should not have had expectations of politicians that they have the capacity for self-criticism. I know that is almost a contradiction in terms. But it was very disappointing to...
But you did expect it, nevertheless.
I was hoping for it. And therefore, in my incorrigible naivety, I was hoping for some spirit of self-criticism, of people to look at themselves and say, where have we gone wrong? What could we have done differently? How can we behave differently in order to bring hope and a meaningful future for our people?
I will address these questions to you personally in a minute. First, Abdul Al-Jaber, which statement made you angry?
Well, there were no Palestinians on the panel. And that's unfortunate because we suffer from people speaking on our behalf and sometimes misrepresenting the voice of the Palestinians, with all due respect to all who try to help the Palestinians. Before this session, I was in another session about the Middle East, and in that session we had three prime ministers, three foreign ministers, the foreign minister of Turkey, the foreign minister of Iran, and the foreign minister of Iraq, and Tony Blair, the ex-prime minister of Britain. And the four of them spoke before me, and I was the last one to speak. And I basically told the audience, and I'm telling you that now, I think you understand why this conflict has been going on for 60 years. It's because it's been handled by these kind of politicians. That's the only explanation, because if you listen to the kind of arguments they bring to the table, and accusations and slogans, and I'm sorry to say that politicians in the region have used this conflict as a way of survival, as a way for them to stay in their offices. And I'm not here pinpointing Israel or this party or another party. This applies for all leaders in the Middle East. They are benefiting from this conflict because they are using it in the Arab countries. They used it to deprive Arab people from democracy for many years. For many years in the Arab countries you hear statements, how could we have democracy while Palestine is occupied? They justified buying the most modern weapons. Trillions of dollars have been wasted to buy weapons in the Arab countries to fight Israel. And at the same time, the same thing can apply in Israel, by the way, because there are lots of Israeli problems that had been delayed or postponed or hidden under the carpet because of the conflict. So I think politicians benefit from the conflict. I think it's about time to have real people deal with this conflict. And in the session before this, I said, if I sit with Idan Ofer is a businessman. He owns a refinery in Israel. If we sit, me and Idan Ofer, 5 minutes, we will sign a peace treaty, a real one, not like the one the politicians signed.
Wir haben hier auf dem Panel keine Politik.
Well, we have no politicians on the panel, so we can go beyond simple slogans today and perhaps begin with a little bit of self-criticism. David Rosen, was the war justified?
Obviously, I come from, I think we all here represent traditions which do not see pacifism as the moral option. In other words, if you, your family and your community are attacked, you have the responsibility to defend. For 7, nearly 8 years, in fact, Israel turned the other cheek. And I think that some form of, something else that was not there in Peres's apologetics, which is important to add. During its, Prime Minister Erdogan was dismissive of the Qassam rockets. And he was saying, you know, these can't do any harm. And I asked Mr. Olmert, and he said people hadn't been killed. There are 2 points to that. One is that Israel took the precautions and, as Prime Minister Peres mentioned, put people in shelters, and therefore you didn't have the same degree of casualties that there could have been. But nevertheless, I think it's true that the initial rockets that were being fired from Gaza were of a very poor quality. But during the 6 months of the ta'adiyah, of the sort of ceasefire, during which, of course, by which time Hamas had expelled the Palestinian Authority, or Fatah, their firepower developed exponentially. And we saw now, during this war, that they have Grad missiles that have the capacity to reach into Israel's cities, into Ashkelon, into Ashdod, and to kill people. Now, just consider the fact that had they have another 6 months without any response, their capacity, because of these unlimited or significant weapons entry into into Gaza, into Hamas-controlled Gaza, would have really been able to threaten Israel's major cities. And therefore the need for some form of response and protection was essential. But, the big but is, did Israel do everything it could have done to have explored every possible option to avoid getting to that stage?
Did it?
I'm not a politician, but in my opinion, even the most odious of people has within them the capacity to be able to change their way of thinking. In other words, I think that here is a real dilemma as to what position should Israel take in relation to Hamas. Hamas, as Peres very eloquently demonstrated, is officially committed to Israel's destruction. But, as also indicated, movements, including also the Israel nationalist movement, the movement of Zionism, all movements have undergone certain processes of transformation. And there are many countries today ruled by people who at some stage or other were viewed as terrorists. And therefore the possibility to find a way of changing and of contacting certain elements within Hamas and seeing how one might be able to modulate, moderate and change attitudes without yet having given up on your right to self-defense, I'm not convinced that all attitudes were explored. I'm also not convinced that the end result of this terrible suffering on both sides, but you can't, I don't think, compare the extent of suffering in Israel to the terrible suffering and loss of life in Gaza. I'm not convinced at the end of this, that the end results are so clear that this tragedy can be so easily justified. I think the principle of self-defense is clear. The need to respond was clear. But whether all possibilities had been exhausted beforehand, and whether it had to be done in such an enormous fashion, I have my doubts.
Abdul, wie haben Sie?
How did you respond to the war? What's your general overview of it?
Well, I belong to a school that believes in the fact that there's nothing that justifies killing innocent lives, and that applies for both. I am against missiles that goes out of Gaza, and equally and more strongly I'm against the Israeli attacks against civilians in Gaza. If you look at the conflict in Gaza, the majority of those who were killed, actually more than 50% are children, young children, and 1/3 are women. So you're talking about only 1/3 of those who were killed in Gaza are fighters or militants. So the vast majority were people who had no choice. They could not go anywhere. They could not hide. And unfortunately, somebody will say that, well, in all wars that's the case. Civilians, innocent people actually will be the losers out of this. And I'll tell you, after the war, I was very touched because 5 of my employees were killed. We own a telecom company, and they were trying to fix and to restore the service in Gaza, and they were killed while on the job by a missile. 5 of my employees were killed. Of course, family relatives of my employees were also killed. After the war was over, I went to visit children who had been, children in difficult conditions had been moved out of Gaza to Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Emirates. So I went to Egypt to visit the injured kids. And to me, I watched my daughters, and I just cannot accept the conditions these kids go through and live. And once again, on both sides, I do not accept that Israeli kids have to be afraid of going to school, or they cannot go play in their playground. I'm not distinguishing between Israeli kids and Palestinian kids. So I went to the hospital in Palestine hospital in Cairo, and there was this boy. His name is Raed Asfour. He's a 10-year-old boy, beautiful face. If you watch him on TV, you will think he's not from Gaza because he's a charming kid. And his face is smashed, and his hand is smashed, And he touched my heart because, I look at this face and it's tough. And I'm speaking to him, and I'm asking him, you will recover very fast and very soon. What do you want to do after you recover? And he cannot speak well because of, the smashed face. And he says, I want to be a telecom engineer. And I said, why? He said, because I want to work in your company. And to me, that was amazing because, this kid is not thinking of revenge. He's not thinking he wants to go and fight and kill. He's thinking he wants to have a job. And I think all kids, that's their dream. And it's a crime, God, what we have done, we adults, that we are putting these kids through this on both sides once again. And that is the part that made me sad, angry, hurt, is knowing that there are all these kids who had to suffer, and it's not their fault. And what my brother mentioned, Rosen, what we have achieved after this war. What we have achieved. Is the situation better than before the war? No, it's much worse. So basically, we lost these 18 lives in Israel, and we lost these 1,300 something in Palestine, and we had destroyed infrastructure. And, well, if after all these lives that were lost, we have something that we can even, dream of being a little bit better than before the war. What somebody, Mr. Perez, said, well, we have basically affected the capabilities of Hamas for attacking Israel. Maybe on a short period of time. The tunnels started operating, the tunnels that he talked about, started operating the second day after the ceasefire. Did not stop. So violence, war, killing will not solve and cannot solve the conflict. Also, you cannot eliminate Hamas is part of the Palestinian people. It's a radical group, yes. There are also radical groups in Israel. The solution is not in eliminating these groups. The solution is through talking to them, and Rosen was absolutely right when he said Fatah was also radical, and Fatah was also calling for the destruction of Israel. And through negotiation, they changed their mind. So at least let's give that option a chance. Let's put Hamas in the corner and make them deprived from any option. And then you can consider whatever options you want in terms of dealing with them. But adopting only one option, which is elimination, I think this is wrong.
We'll come to the involvement of Hamas in a moment. First, I'd like to put a question to Mrs. Voldrup. You've worked a lot in Jerusalem, been there for 2.5 years now. Do you believe that what Mr. Al-Jaber says is right, that it's worse than ever before and that none of the peace process has helped? Well, In 96, 97, I studied at the Hebrew University. In 2004, 2005, I was involved in an interreligious project. And I've been living since 2006 in the Palestinian part of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. And what I've seen over the last 10 years leave me rather with the impression that things haven't got better. The question that you asked was very simple. Was this war justified? And maybe it would have been clearer to hear a yes from the Israeli side and a no from the Palestinian side, and then we would have been able to have clear positions in the argument. But if I've learned one thing in the Middle East, it's that there are no simple answers, even if we want them. And that's why we need to be extremely discerning when we approach these questions. And despite all of the difficulties, try not to give up hope. Even if I don't doubt the right to self-defense of Israel, I believe also that violence should be avoided. We need to do our utmost to reduce violence. It's led us to a humanitarian disaster in Gaza, which hasn't brought us any further, which hasn't moved us one single step towards peace. Mrs. Villa, you say there are no simple answers, but I must put it simple questions. Do you, as an outsider, see a solution for this Gordian knot? Well, first of all, don't give up hope, because all three religions believe in the power of God and that change is possible. And I think that the most important message that we can carry with us is not to give up, even if it seems that things are going badly, the ceasefire isn't holding, the outlook isn't bright. Mitchell is there on the ground, but has had to take a lot of criticism because he hasn't been speaking with Hamas, because he has made certain visits which have been criticized. Despite this criticism, I think we should take the new US President Barack Obama at his word. He does want to do something, and hopefully something will happen. If pressure is imposed on both sides from outside, then things might move on. If the Palestinians can speak with one voice, and if the Israelis and the Palestinians can show a desire for peace, then things might move on. Now, George Mitchell has been mentioned by Mrs. Volrab, who hasn't met with Hamas to speak. He's explicitly avoided that. Is that the problem, Mr. Al-Jaber, or is it that the Palestinians can't agree to speak with a single voice?
I do not support Hamas. I think Hamas is not in a position and cannot run the government in Palestine for a million reasons, for practical reasons. Aside from the issue of ideology and the conditions, etc., for practical reasons, because simply the air we breathe, the water we drink, the electricity we have in our homes, the fuel that we have in our cars, the tomato we have in our table is all coming from Israel. So could you tell me how on earth would the government run the affairs of people who are totally dependent on Israel without talking to Israel? How could you do that? So in practical terms, that's not possible. Our mistake was the following. When Hamas won the elections, and I'm not in favor, and I don't support Hamas to form the government, but they won the elections. You call it democracy. They won the elections. I think the biggest mistake was not to allow them to go and basically run this government. Why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because 1 week after Hamas taking over the government because Mr. Peres talked about there were no closure, nothing. That's not true. The closure came from immediately after they formed the government, from the Americans, from the Canadians, from the Palestinian Authority itself. Everybody was not happy and was boycotting Hamas. So you gave them a justification. You gave them the reason to say, well, we did not manage, not because we are not capable, but because everybody is against us, and this is wrong. I think they would have failed because they are not capable, not because people are against them. So this is mistake number one. So coming now and not talking to Hamas is a mistake. I said before, solution is not through elimination, it's through inclusion. Bring them to the table. What Hamas says behind closed doors is not what they say in the open. Hamas, one very famous singer, I will not mention his name, very, very famous. He came to the Holy Land, and he's a good friend of mine. And he asked to meet with Hamas. And I found it very strange that this famous British singer wants to meet with Hamas. So I brought them to my house, and he sat with them in my house. And they were talking. And I told the guy from Hamas, God damn it, why you are not saying this outside? Why you are saying this in a closed door?
What did he say?
He recognized the right of Israel to exist, and he's against violence, and all what you want to hear. It's behind closed doors. That tells me something. That tells me through inclusion, through smart moves, you might, I'm not guaranteeing it, but at least it's an option. It's not fair. It's a crime not to explore it. Not to expose these guys and say, fine, what do you want? The other day, their leader in a public speak said he accepts two-state solution based on the borders of 1967. He said it in a public speech. And this is the first time I hear Hamas leader Khalid Mish'al saying it when he was in Doha, Qatar. He said, we accept Arab Peace Initiative. Now, when there is such a statement mentioned, I think that's a development that it is a mistake not to explore. I repeat, Mitchell or even Tony Blair or any politician, it's a mistake not to talk to these guys. Because if you take all the movements, Tony Blair was talking about Sinn Féin in Ireland, and we all know what was Sinn Féin categorized. When they spoke to Sinn Féin and the IRA, what happened? You had peace. So these guys, they might end up approving or they cannot be included because they insist on their position. That's a possibility. And they might end up changing their ideology and their position and accepting the new realities and accepting the fact that there must be two states living side by side, next to each other, in peace and harmony. If that is what they will come up with, we all win. If they insist on their statement they don't recognize Israel and they want to destroy Israel, then they will force everybody to exclude them. And I think that is an option, that is a path that should be explored by Mitchell and by anybody else.
David, would you allow Hamas to the talks?
Well, you can see that you may have made a mistake by inviting my friend Abdul and myself to be on the same panel.
Because
together.
you're too nice to each other.
Because, if you'll excuse my immodesty, we are both sensible people, but we are also friends. And I think I think simply reflect the fact that there are so many friendships between Palestinians and Israelis. We are so similar to one another. And if you go around and if you move between Palestine and Israel, you see virtually the same foods, you hear the same sounds, you see often the same mentalities. I mean, it makes it even more distressing to see why this conflict just continues when we really are so much part of one family.
And the friendships did not stop the rockets on either side. What would you suggest?
That's exactly the point. I think the tragedy, we are all victims of conflict, and Abdul has already mentioned that. But I say there is no question that Palestinian suffering has been the greatest suffering in the Holy Land. But I think the greatest tragedy of the Palestinian people has been their leadership that has let them down time again. And Hamas, I don't dispute everything that Abdul has just mentioned, but if Hamas would have tried to make Gaza work and show that they could have been responsible, we could have avoided this situation. We could have avoided this tragedy. I think he is right when he says that we have to find ways to be more flexible and to test Hamas. That's true. But Hamas, in my opinion, bears the greatest responsibility, and in this regard I agree with Peres's comments, for this tragedy that has befallen Gaza. And I think Hamas needs to be able to come to terms with that. Maybe some of them are. Maybe some understand that and they need to make it a going concern. Let me also add, I was Chief Rabbi of Ireland. Before that, I was Rabbi of South Africa. I only know conflict situations. They generally improve when I leave. And therefore, some people want to get rid of me and send me away from Jerusalem, where I live now. But nevertheless, all those situations, South Africa and Ireland, have proved that the intractable, the seemingly impossible, can be overcome. We can achieve a resolution. I believe that not only that peace is possible, I believe that over 70% of Israelis and Palestinians know what it looks like. They know where we need to go. They know it's more or less the Clinton parameters. The tragedy for both Palestinians and Israelis today is that we do not have leadership that is both sensible and strong at the same time. And therefore we are very dependent, here I agree with the pastor, that we are very dependent upon outside engagement here, but not from outside imposed resolution. This will not work. It has to be enough persuasion from outside that the leaders understand what they have to do, and there have to be enough carrots as well as enough sticks.
Sie sagten mir bei einem Vorgespräch,
before we spoke, you said perhaps the war would force the international community not just to stand by and look on. Was it too passive beforehand? If we see more initiatives coming, will we see movement as well?
Well, I think, first of all, I agree also with Abdul that the Arab initiative, the Saudi initiative, is a very important one. And I think a scenario has been created in the Middle East of where there is greater, not only interest, but greater need on the part of the region to find a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think that this tragedy, now this tragic conflict war, has convinced also, increasingly convinced, the world that has understood that this conflict has global ramifications. This conflict is used, as Abdul mentioned earlier, as the excuse for so many terrible things that continue in the world, and for so many refusals for people to look themselves in the mirror and say, where maybe I have gone wrong and what I am responsible to do. So if you like, so many complexes, both contemporary and historical, focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's become a lightning conductor. And the world is beginning to understand that resolving this conflict has global potential. And that is why Obama has declared this principal commitment. And therefore I think that this tragedy has actually provided a silver lining. A silver lining in which there has been more European engagement than ever before. I mean, to see the day after the ceasefire, the political leaders of France, of Italy, of Britain, of Spain, all lined up in Mr. Olmert's house to be able to give support to bring the ceasefire to some form of realization, shows how Europe understands its importance. So I am actually optimistic. I'm optimistic that together with the Arab world, particularly through the leadership of Saudi Arabia and the involvement of Egypt as well, and of course the existential needs of Jordan. There is a greater desire on the part of the Arab world to live with Israel, not because they love Israel, they still dream that Israel would disappear, but they recognize Israel's going to be around and they've got to come to terms with it. And I think that there is therefore a pragmatic reality there, which together with European and American involvement can actually bring about a resolution.
Sie sagen, dass sich alle großen Staatsvertreter da.
You said that it's possible that there might be much greater involvement. What about Germany, Mrs. Wohlrab? Why isn't...
Chancellor Merkel, excuse me. I left her out of the list of European leaders. My apologies.
No problem. Das ist
Well, that issue is something which is mentioned by visitors to Jerusalem who come to our centre in Jerusalem. But it's also a question that comes from our Palestinian workers and when I come together and meet with Israeli friends. Why isn't more happening, I'm asked. There is the theory that Israel simply doesn't allow itself to be persuaded, but if you look back to the Madrid conference in '92, that wouldn't have come about without pressure from outside, as was the case with many other conferences. The election of the Palestinian parliament was initially to take place without votes in eastern Jerusalem, and that was something that was avoided by outside pressure as well. So I think that can bring something. Germany's role can certainly help. It's difficult at the moment, though. On both sides, there's a good level of trust and confidence that has been built, and I think that could be tapped. At the moment, it's rather difficult. As you may have seen, there have been clear expressions of solidarity with Israel. That's simply something which is something that won't change as a result of the past. The Palestinians say, well, why don't you speak out as loudly for us as well? And there I think that will be a task that Mr. Steinmeier will have, really to express support, provide support for both sides, and see what can happen, not just with political pressure, but with all of the international organizations as well, which are committed in the area. We have to recognize that there is enormous commitment here. Over recent years, however, the impression has emerged that it's not enough. The whole world is sending through its NGOs and organizations enormous levels of assistance. But that's not enough. There needs to be a further step, which is that we need to recognize the importance of political support, which would move both sides towards a solution. And I agree with Rabbi Rosen. There needs to be support which will bring those negotiators to the table who wish for peace and have the power to reach peace. Abdul Jabbar, when I looked at your website a couple of weeks ago, there was a picture of destruction. You described you've described that you described that some of your workers had been killed. Yesterday I looked, there were some Mother Day greetings. Now, does that mean that business is back to normal and that the best thing to do is simply to wait for international pressure to have an effect? Is your view now that I'm looking to the future, I'm waiting for business to get back on its feet, rather than trying to bring political pressure to bear?
I think to bring life back to normal, you have to go on the two tracks, because if you want to rely and to wait for external pressure or external help, these days that's complicated, because until now there's this debate who will be responsible for the reconstruction of Gaza, unfortunately. I have to admit that the internal Palestinian conflict itself is a problem, is a serious problem. And now you have all this debate, who's going to be responsible for the reconstruction of the homes, while you have thousands of families who doesn't have homes, while these politicians are fighting who's going to be in charge of building the homes, which is stupid. So you cannot wait for this external aid and coming from different countries. I mean, in the Kuwait summit that was about 10 days ago, the Arab countries raised $2 billion, and there will be soon in Egypt another summit for the reconstruction of Gaza. Now, I have to differentiate between the intervention coming from outside, because unfortunately, the split on the ground in Palestine is being instigated and influenced by the split between the Arab and Muslim countries, which is very, very, very bad. You have some Arab countries who are categorized as the radical countries, including Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, and Qatar, and other countries, who basically take one line, and you have Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia taking a different line, and these are putting money, and these putting money, and these are putting their conditions, and these are putting their conditions. So this is complicating things on the ground. Now, I belong to the school that believes that we have to have homegrown solutions, homegrown initiatives, where Palestinians and Palestinian private sector must lead the way and not wait for the government, regardless if it's a unity government, or it's a Gaza government, or it's Ramallah government, regardless all of this confusion. Or
said the Palestinian people is not able to do that.
I'll tell you.
You don't like him?
I agree with David. We have a problem of leadership, and that's a serious problem. And I don't want to elaborate further on this, but it is very unfortunate, and it's very painful and embarrassing to admit in front of an audience like this that this is a serious problem. And this gives a very good excuse for a person like Mr. Shimon Peres, whom I respect and I know very well, to say, what do you want us to do? The Palestinians are not agreeing among each other. What do you want us to do? They are not able to agree on who runs the crossing points. They are not able to agree who builds this or who builds that. So unfortunately, that's a tragedy, that's a disaster, and it has to end. Now, unfortunately, for that to end, you have two possibilities. Either local leaders would wake up and find the solution themselves, and there are some initiatives and courageous moves that are happening these days on the ground. The other option is for the Arab countries to leave us alone and not to involve us in the differences that are existing between the Arab regimes, which are reflected on the ground in Palestine, and basically have some constructive involvement. Constructive involvement means looking at the interests of Palestinians, not settling accounts between the superpowers and between the regional players. Everybody knows that the Middle East now, you have these regional players trying to send a message to Obama that we are the address and come talk to us, and we are the ones who can make troubles or make peace. And unfortunately, they are using the Palestinian conflict to send this ticket to Obama, or this message to Obama. But I think it's the Palestinian responsibility to take the lead on solving the internal conflict, and to really come out united with one position. We have a just cause. There is no argument that occupation must end, that West Bank and Gaza are occupied. There is no dispute that the solution is to have two-state solutions where Israelis will withdraw from Palestine. There are lots of given facts that nobody can argue. This argument of liberating Palestine or ending the conflict or ending occupation would be much more powerful if you have a unified Palestinian position, and all the differences within Palestine to be handled through talks and negotiations and reconciliation, and that's possible. And I think there are things that Israel can do and should do. And I meet with Israeli officials all the time, and I tell them, listen, having a strong Palestine, a prosperous Palestine, is in the best interest of Israel. Absolutely, Israel can invest in building walls and the best artillery in the world. Believe me, that's a very expensive investment, but it will not protect the state of Israel. It will not bring security. There is another option that is much more effective and much, much, much less expensive having a prosperous, democratic, strong, viable state in Palestine. There's a person, his name is Marwan Barghouti. He's in jail. He's a great leader, a Palestinian leader. I've been saying to all my Israeli friends and politicians, you have a Mandela Palestine behind bars. Go and strike a deal with him. Then release him. Then we have elections. The story will be finished. Very simple. Some people will say, well, what guarantees do we have? Do you have a better solution? Then if you have a better solution, please bring it. I have this solution. I'm proposing this solution. At least I'm coming up with an initiative. I will mention something else. There are many initiatives on the ground between Israelis and Palestinians. On the ground. Other than what Mr. Perez mentioned in terms of the Paris Center. You know, with all due respect to the Paris Center, that's a political establishment. I'm talking about real things. Between real people, between business people. People will be shocked to know that a Palestinian company like mine, we have Israelis working for us. Jewish Israelis. I'm not talking about Arab Israelis. Jewish Israelis working for us. We are creating right now the first venture capital fund, which is joint, common between real people who have the same vision for the future. Things on the ground, what David mentioned, we are the same, we are alike, we have no problem. I used to live in a village, a very small village. No longer because I left to Canada and now I live in Jerusalem. We share the same city. And in that very small village in the north of Palestine, whole Muslim village, we had one family that was not Muslim, a Christian family. A man, his wife and 2 daughters. And he was a nurse, this man. And he was the only nurse. And all women of my village would go to this male Christian nurse. And it was not an issue. I'm sorry to tell you that today, if it was a Muslim nurse, my old mother would say, no, I don't want to go. Something wrong happened. And we are responsible for this. We are losing this openness in our region. The region is becoming more and more radical, and that's very serious and very dangerous. We have to solve it, and the only way we can solve it is through having peace, because the conflict is behind all of this radicalization.
I'm getting a sign from Thomas Vift that I should now open up the questions to the audience, because time is moving on fast. But just at the end there was a very important point made, which we should perhaps pick up on again, which is the strengthening of fundamentalism on both sides, which makes the conflict more intractable. So maybe we can come back to that a little bit. But first, a question from the audience here at the front.
Would there be interest in both sides in fighting peacefully? I was in Nablus teaching Palestinians to fight peacefully, and it was very strange for them. They said, we tried nonviolence and we were shot at. And I said, you got it wrong. You have to look from your enemy's point of view. How do they want you to fight them? And they were just chicken. It turns out that but I went single-handedly. I went to the checkpoint. I just showed, like by singing gospel songs, I was able to satisfy 150 agitated Palestinian men trying to go home and 15 Israeli soldiers with semi-automatic weapons. So, and then when I talked to the Palestinians, say, what do you want? I said, you have to tell them the truth. And the kind of solution that seems to be relevant would be like a two-Israel solution. So a little tiny Israel that would be a nation state for those Jews who want a nation state. But most Jews don't want a nation state. Most Jews would prefer to live in Palestine, which might include parts of Egypt, parts of Jordan, southern Lebanon, the Golan Heights, parts of Israel. And it would be a very strong buffer state, and they would be very good allies, because the Palestinians have had better life under Israelis than under any Arab countries that they know. So I'm just wondering if these kinds of solutions, could be fought peacefully for, and if anyone would be interested to send me, I'd be happy to go. Thank you.
Just in order for us to be able to answer as many questions as possible, to whom exactly do you want to address the question first?
To Mr. Rosen.
Do you want me to answer? Well, I'm not sure that I've completely understood. First of all, I agree that we should try to employ non-violent means as much as possible. I agree with, I think, something if I understood correctly, that we the way to deal in situations of conflict and even of moderate tension is to always try to connect with the other and to try to understand the fears of the other and what are the needs of the other. And the more we can do that, in fact, there is a model known as nonviolent communication, coming very much out of Carl Rogers' psychology, which is precisely designed to that. And I think were we to train people, both Israelis and Palestinians, and this applies everywhere, Sri Lanka, Kashmir, Nigeria, to train people to know how to talk to one another in a manner that both expresses your own feelings and your needs and responds to the feelings and the needs of the others, we could actually overcome a great deal of violence and find a way to be able to live together with much greater understanding. I'm not sure what you're referring to about most Jews would prefer not to live in a Jewish nation state and to live in a Palestine. If I understand you correctly, I must strongly disagree. Of course, I think it's true that most Israelis would willingly give up the idea of a nation state if they were convinced that they could live in peace and be able to guarantee their own life and culture. But when we look around us in the Middle East, it's not a reason to be particularly sanguine or optimistic. We don't live in a particularly nice corner of the world. Moses was not sent, unfortunately, to New Zealand. He ended up in a place, the only place in the Middle East where there is no oil, incidentally, and a place where there are, generally speaking at the moment, corrupt and violent regimes. And there is no reason why Israelis should be expect that living under one of those regimes in the neighborhood will be able to guarantee the tranquility it needs. I also think that it's not a fair and appropriate way to address the Palestinian community. Palestinians deserve the right of their own state and their own specific dignity, not as part of Jordan and not as part of Egypt. Inshallah, please God, the day will come when we can have a confederation of Palestine, Israel, Jordan, where you will be able to drive like in Europe without realizing even that you've moved over the border, and we will be able to share that. But we need to go through certain stages before we get there. To try to get there before you've gone through those stages will be to try to run before you can walk, and we will fall flat on our face and do ourselves an injury.
Bitte schön, die nächsten Fragen, vielleicht von ganz hinten.
Maybe a microphone at the back. On the right-hand side.
Mein Name ist
Sidney Weil. I have a question to Mr. Jaber. I'm going to be speaking in German. I hope it's going to be translated. I have the feeling, Mr. Jaber, that if the Palestinians had a better economy, if they were more prosperous, we wouldn't have this problem. There are situations where this has happened. I was in a village in Abu Ghosh, it's only 15 minutes from Jerusalem, where there was an excellent Arab restaurant, no parking spaces left on Saturdays because all of the Jews would come from Jerusalem to this restaurant in Abu Ghosh. Now, obviously, all that glitters is not gold in Israel, but it would certainly be an improvement on the situation as it currently is in Gaza and the other occupied territories, and in the camps where the Palestinians have been for over 40 years. When I think that those states that have oil have 60 billion revenues a day, surely they could spare just 1 billion a day to improve the Palestinian economy and make them throw no bombs.
I do agree that creating hope for the Palestinians and translating this hope into reality, prosperous life, is the key to this conflict. And let me share with you a crazy idea that I presented to late late President Arafat, immediately after Oslo. Because I come from this school that says economy will bring peace, not peace will bring economy. A lot of people disagree with me. And my argument to Arafat was open Palestine to Israeli investors. You have in Israel a complex society. You have people who are secular. They have problem to make secular marriages inside Israel. Maybe Rabbi will not like this. But there are people who are going to Cyprus and other places to get married. I said, well, open Ramallah so they can come and get married in Ramallah. Why to go to Cyprus? You have Israelis who like the kosher food. Well, you know, come up with this kosher industry and allow all these rabbis to come and produce kosher food in Ramallah. And invite the top business leaders in Israel to come and build factories. Dov Lotman, who's producing socks around the world and underwear around the world, let him come and produce the underwears in Gaza and build the hotels on the beaches of Gaza. And my argument was very simple. You have to create interest. The minute you create interest, Israeli interest in Palestine and Palestinian interest coming from Israel, when you create this interest, all of this stupid ideology will disappear slowly, slowly. Because imagine you have $2-3 billion of Israeli investments in Gaza. And when I talk about Dov Lotman or Dan Ofer or these guys, if an Israeli prime minister will think that he's going to close the borders, they will be waking him up early in the morning, telling him, what the heck are you doing? Are you crazy? I have $3 billion in Gaza. You want to destroy my business? So you will basically turn the Israeli community to an ally. You can never make peace and have peace if the Israeli community is your enemy, if the Israeli community is afraid, if the Israeli community is fearing this missile or that bullet. I belong to this school. Actually, I always said Palestinians should never respond to Israeli aggression using violence, even if the Israeli army is attacking or coming to any city. The maximum, if you are so angry and if you want to throw something at an Israeli soldier, it should be a cut flower, a carnation flower. That's the maximum thing you should throw. Why? Because you will never be able to, I don't believe in violence, but I'm going to use a logical argument. Because you will never be able to defeat them. It's stupid. These missiles from Gaza will never defeat Israel. It will create fear? Wrong. It will not create fear. So I believe in this ideology of creating interests from both sides. And believe me, we have seen it in the good days of the peace process. But we, the business community, we were sleeping. We did not really take or seize this opportunity in the good days of the peace process to start doing real business on the ground. Real opportunities on the ground so that people will touch, feel the fruits of peace. I think that's the only way to go. And I do believe economy is the only way to bring peace.
Ms. Al-Jaber, why don't you run for president to solve the leadership problem? Next question, please, here in the very front.
What we all know is in the last 3 weeks, more than 1,300 people died. And 500 of them were babies, child, and women. And we all know that Israel has the highest military technology. And my question is, why couldn't Israel distinguish the differences between a baby and a terrorist? And then
we don't have any war engineer here on stage. That's a very difficult question to answer here, isn't it?
Yeah, but the question is, I think, so clear.
Pardon me?
I think the question is clear. Clear now.
I'll try to answer.
Okay.
So you want me to answer?
No, it's okay.
Maybe
no, on the contrary, I'd far prefer you to answer.
Well, I'll tell you. I think what happened in Gaza is a tragedy. It should not have happened. I said earlier, there's no justification for it to happen. I think Israel, and I agree with Rosen, if you look at the outcome, then you suspect the whole justification without questioning the right of self-defense, which nobody argues about. I mean, obviously, self-defense, then the Hamas will use it, that what they are doing in terms of throwing missiles is self-defense, and then you will go into the argument of Israel.
But Mr. Al-Jaber, just if I understood the question correct, the problem is also in what we heard on the panel, you know, that Hamas is within society, within the Palestinian people. This means that there were, you know, lots of casualties.
Okay. If you know, Gaza is the most dense place on earth. You don't have mountains and wadis and valleys in Gaza. This is not south of Lebanon. Gaza, there's no place other than homes. So I wish, you know, to avoid these innocent lives, that you have rooms to maneuver. For those who know Gaza, Israel have cleared and cleaned all the border areas around Gaza. Basically wiped out and destroyed everything all across the border zones. So there is no people living and around the borders. So all people are living in concentrated areas, what you see on television, Jabalia, Beit Lahia, Shatter refugee camps. These are populated areas. So when you have people fighting, where do you want them to fight? To go to the open areas where anybody can shoot them? They have no choice but to fight from within the streets of Gaza. When you have such a populated area, and that's why I'm saying the whole war concept was wrong, because Israel knew that they cannot at all avoid children. They can't, because of the characteristics, because of the type of the population. And that's why that war should have been avoided and not happened. Now, once again, it's not a war between two armies. I mean, you don't have two armies fighting. You know, this army has its tanks and artilleries and helicopters and F-16s, and the other army maybe have the MiG-18 and the MiG-21. You know, as it used to be before. One country is equipped with Russian weapons and the other country is equipped with the American weapons. It's not the case. Hamas, yes, they had smuggled missiles coming from Iran or from Hezbollah or wherever. Once again, I don't think Hamas made the right choice and the sound decision by throwing missiles on Israel. I think that was a wrong decision from Hamas side. But I think the loss of innocent lives is something that Israel must deeply look into, and do not accept the justifications that are received from the soldiers on the ground, because soldiers on the ground are not telling the truth. I'll give you a personal example of things that happen on the ground. In the West Bank, there are settlements all over the West Bank. And there are settlers living all over the West Bank. And I was personally traveling. I have an Israeli plate because I live in Jerusalem. I have an Israeli Jerusalem ID. And I'm driving with my car, with my driver, on the road, going back to Jerusalem. There is a settlement called Yitzhar. On the road, there were 4 settlers blocking the road, preventing Palestinian cars, because Palestinian cars have different plates than the Israeli cars. So Palestinian cars did not dare to approach these 4 settlers. And they were not burning tires or anything, they're just walking in the street. And there were about 30 soldiers. And the 30 soldiers were protecting the 4 settlers. And these settlers, if a car approaches, they will look into it. If the car is occupied by Jews, they allow it to pass. If it's Palestinians, no. So I come. I have an Israeli plate. And they stopped me. And the settler told the soldier, "Ze Arabi lo avor." This is an Arabic person, he's not allowed to pass. That's a settler telling the soldier. What did the soldier do? The soldier told me, ordered me to go back, that I'm not allowed to cross. I argued with the soldier, what the hell is this? I mean, you are the soldier supposed to be implementing law, and this guy is violating the law, and you are, preventing me? That's not the story. I reported this. I complained. The soldier told him, no, it did not happen. The soldiers, of course, and the commander, he's going to take my word. Of course, he's going to take what the soldier said, what the soldier stated. He said, well, there were some, life threats, and we wanted to protect the life of Abdul Malik because maybe we thought he's going to be attacked. Of course, that's the story that will go out. Now, soldiers will send reports, whatever reports. So I think it's for the sake of the Israeli government to look into this and study it carefully and make sure that these kind of tragedies, hopefully there will be no wars, hopefully there will be no more fighting, hopefully this will be the last time. But I repeat, losses in Gaza cannot be justified under no conditions.
Muss mal von hinten noch eine Frage nehmen, auf der rechten Seite.
One more question at the back on the right.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Jabber, you said that the economy, and investment are the only solution, but do you believe that the rockets will stop with investment? Maybe in the long term, yes, but what about the short term? What will happen when the rockets continue? Will they not hamper the investment efforts? What can be done to stop the rockets and encourage economic investment?
Well, definitely, I think you cannot have a proper investment environment with instability. Regardless, this instability is coming from rockets or from Israeli soldiers attacking, or from 600 checkpoints that exist in the West Bank. 600 checkpoints make life almost miserable. So what I mentioned in terms of economy will bring peace, it's not in terms of just a theoretical approach to this. This needs commitment, dedication, and heavy investments from regional players, from the wealthy Gulf states, from Europe, from the States, into coming and rebuilding the country with real projects, with big projects. That will stop missiles. I assure you that will stop missiles, because, listen, when people have no hope, when they are cornered, and they don't dream of tomorrow, tomorrow means nothing to them. Their life doesn't mean nothing to them. So you think they're going to be rational? They're going to be afraid that this prosperous life, or this house, or this job, or this business is going to disappear? There's unemployment in Gaza was about 70%. There's no jobs. There's no hope. So with people living under these conditions, do you think they want to be rational and calm and come and make philosophical assumptions? Of course not. So you have to give them hope. You have to create jobs, and the only way to create jobs is having investments and big projects. And when you have that, and I assure you, based on experience, when you have that, when you have hope, and translate this into material achievements on the ground, where people are going to feel that there is something they will lose. Now, in Gaza, people have nothing to lose. So they throw missiles, they throw whatever they want to throw, because they have nothing to lose. You need to make them feel that there is something they will lose, so that they will start thinking in a different way.
Frau Ulrike Wohlrath möchte genau zu diesem Punkt noch etwas.
Ulrike Wohlrath would like to add something to that. Yes, I'd like to come back on that. There was a survey after the ceasefire in June 2008 amongst Gaza Palestinians, asking them, what do you think of this ceasefire? 80% answered, I don't care. And I think, or it brings me nothing, rather. And I think that it's not only from the Israeli side, but from the international side that improvements could come. David Rosen asked the question, can't we look at ourselves and apply a bit of self-criticism? And the international community should perhaps ask, could we not have helped the Gaza people better to ensure that the blockade was lifted at the same time as the smuggling was stopped? And I think that these questions have to be asked to everybody. If we are hoping for economic growth in the area, then we need to think about the checkpoints. We need to think about firms which need to be able to export. At the moment, the road to Bethlehem has so many checkpoints on it. It's simply not possible to transport parts or components or whatever. What's needed is a space for the Palestinians to be able to develop. And this serves Israel's interests as well. As Mr. Al-Jaber has mentioned, if that's not the case, then there won't be any security. Obviously, there needs to be development, both economical and educational. At the moment, there are no jobs. There's 60 to 80% unemployment in the villages around Jerusalem at the moment. There's a high level of drug criminality. The rubbish is being burnt in response to the war. But I don't think that we can hope for a better future unless there's an economical improvement. I'd ask for the gentleman here to ask a question now. Yes, Beat Fopp. I'm a Swiss national. I'm very happy to be a Swiss national. It's a beautiful country, a peaceful country, blue skies and snow. Your question, please? Well, despite all that, I have a very important question to these two gentlemen. What can Switzerland do in order to improve its, as a neutral country, in order to improve its contribution to a peaceful solution in the Middle East?
Answers in order to be able to answer a lot more questions, please, David Rosen.
What you have heard here, is that we have a continuous chicken and egg situation. Roadblocks need to be removed in order to allow economy to develop. Israel says then violence has to cease in order to be able to remove roadblocks. We might also mention in the past that, there was development in the Palestinian economy before the Second Intifada. So while I agree very strongly with Mr. Al-Jaber with regards to the importance of economic development, I'm not sure that it's the only factor at stake. So we need a variety of factors. And there is also a big psychological problem. It's not only the breakdown of trust that has taken place over the last few years, there is also a mentality that exists both amongst Israelis and Palestinians, which in modern social science is called the zero-sum mentality. That is, that there is assumption amongst Palestinians and their supporters that if what is good for Palestinians must be bad for Israelis. That if you care about Palestinian dignity and national self-determination, somehow you have to be dismissive of Israel's security concerns and even sometimes hostile towards Israel. And on the other hand, if you care about Israel's security and well-being, you have to be dismissive of Palestinian claims and aspirations for dignity and well-being. What we need to educate our communities to do is to get out of this zero-sum mentality and to get much closer to what Abdul just described earlier before, of a win-win mentality.
And what could
a win-win mentality. Now, a win-win mentality means that you need to give both sides an understanding that support for one does not mean that it has to be at the expense of the other. And in order to give that sense, you need also to not only practically support, therefore investing in joint ventures, such as those already described to us, but also in those NGOs, in those non-business areas where Palestinians and Israelis work together for civil society, for civil rights, for the advancement of women, for the areas, therefore, of law and both of accountability, transparency, responsible media. All these are areas where there needs to be investment from outside in initiatives, especially initiatives where there is Palestinian-Israeli cooperation. That's not only developing the economy, but helping overcome the mentality that assumes that what is good for me must be bad for you, and what is good for you must be bad for me.
Apart from setting up joint ventures or supporting joint ventures, what else could Switzerland do on this behalf?
I think, by the way, I'm also from a country with snow and sun. I'm from Canada as well, so and it's a peaceful country as well. But I chose to leave Canada and to live in the very troubled region. Personal choice. I think Switzerland, because it is recognized as a peaceful, neutral country, nobody can accuse Switzerland of being pro or anti this party or that party. I do think that Switzerland, working with maybe the non-business side through community organizations on both sides, to try to show a Swiss model that's working, because there are different cultures in Switzerland, and there are differences in Switzerland, and to show that, you know, how can this model be attractive, and this is in terms of education and awareness. Now, of course, this is what we call long-term approach, but if you want to have a very immediate, fast-track approach, well, I have an idea. The million Israelis who live around Gaza who have been affected, and the 1.5 million Gazans, you can bring them to Switzerland for 6 months. And then we can rebuild Gaza and the Israeli areas around it. And after spending 6 months in Switzerland, I think they will be different people. So when they go back, they can live together in peace like the way you are living in peace. So this is something, if your government is willing to spend money on, I think you will be doing the whole region a great favor. And I think this is not a crazy idea. I think even you can do it at small scale, but you can expand it to bring people together and show them, not only through education, but through real life. This is a beautiful country. I don't think they will mind to come from Sderot and from areas inside Gaza who have been under several conditions. I think they will not mind the cold. I think they might prefer it.
Und auch ziemlich provokativ, ungewöhnlicher Vorschlag.
Well, that's a very original, perhaps provocative suggestion. Perhaps from Mrs. Volrab, another suggestion. Well, just to come back on what we've heard, that we need more than just economical development. What I see at the moment is that as a result of the war, all of the work on dialogue has really fallen flat. It needs to be built from scratch again. Any country can help there, but what's most important is that trust be rebuilt. That wherever we see the desire for a political solution, we can see the potential for positive developments. There are very few signs of this at the moment, and therefore it's extremely important that there be a conscious effort to remove the huge mutual fear which exists. It's very difficult to find people who are ready to talk at all. Now, we have people here tonight who are clearly talking, but in Jerusalem, where I live, there are many people who say, no, I simply couldn't do it, I wouldn't dare to do it, I simply cannot do it, too much has happened. And every country can help in resolving that, because quite a lot of people who come to the region simply burn out after a few years. They're sad that they haven't achieved anything. So we constantly need new blood, people who come to the area, who get an understanding of what's happening in the field, and then can come home and spread the message of what's needed. We have another question here, a young man who's been tirelessly keeping his arm up.
First of all, thank you very much for me. Here, actually, I'm a bit disappointed because we are talking about just the problems between Palestine and Israel. But when we are talking about Middle East, we should also include the other countries like Lebanon, Iran, or Turkey. I mean, the problem of Middle East is not just between Israel and Palestine. There are also some problems like between Sunni people and Shia people, as well as there is a potential problem between Turkish and Kurdish. So when we are talking about the Middle East, we should talk all of them. And now we are talking about just the last war between Palestine and Israel. Mr. Al-Jabbar and Mr. Rosen told that the devil is Hamas. But I'm asking you, if the devil is Hamas, then before 40 years ago or 60 years ago, why you were fighting? And I don't know, my suggestion is that, for example, when we look at the last century, we see that really European Union is a really peace project. We know that after the Second World War, French and Germany, England, everyone was fighting with each other. But after the European Union, now they have shared benefits and common benefits, so they stop fighting with each other. I'm thinking about that also is possible for the Middle East. I'm not talking about the Arab League, but I'm talking about a union, a Middle East union, maybe including Israel. It will be perfect. But even Israel reject to be inside this union, I think it will still bring peace. Why? Because now we see that, for example, I think it was 4 months ago, the Russian attacked Georgia. Why? Because Georgia is not a member of European Union and is not a member of NATO, so it means that it's easy to attack Georgia. But if you, for example, if there is a union in the Middle East, I think the Israel will think twice before attacking the Palestine, because when he attacks, it means that you are attacking all the Middle East. I hope that also Israel join this Middle East Union, because it's to benefit all the Middle East. But the problem is, just a second, because when we are talking about the past, this project, maybe we cannot name it as a union, but in the time of Ottoman Empire, all these people are living in peace. So we can, I think, make it again, if we really believe, and we can make it again. And my question is, Mr. Al-Jabbar, do you think that is possible? And also, Ms. Rosen, do you think that this European Union, this Middle East Union, is a threat for Israel, or is also for benefit to Israel, and would you like to join this union?
Ich möchte angesichts der vorgeschrittenen Zeit vielleicht...
Given that we're running out of time, maybe we can just get a brief response from David Rosen with regard to the union.
You know, asking a clergyman to be brief is very difficult. It's an occupational hazard. So, just very, very quickly then. Why are we fighting now? You say, why are we accusing Hamas if there was a conflict beforehand? There was a conflict beforehand, but we actually made a step out of that conflict. And we got to Oslo. And Israel pulled out of most of the West Bank. And therefore we were moving, and even though there have been ups and downs and difficulties, there was still a relationship with the Palestinian Authority. Hamas has certainly turned the clock back from that point of view, because, as you heard already before, the Fatah had changed, but whereas Hamas now remains irredentis. So I don't, again, as you heard from me already this evening, I don't leave Israel off the hook, and I don't leave anybody else off the hook. But obviously, the change within Hamas is critical in order to be able to move ahead. The idea of a Middle East Union, as you heard, I was even hinting at something, is a great vision down the road. But in order to be able to get to a union of countries, you actually need them to function in a democratic fashion. If you're dealing essentially with dictatorships or with autocratic structures, then the possibilities for such are very, very limited. And that's another reason why Palestinian independence is so important, and autonomy. Because Palestinian society is actually the most democratic of all Arab societies in Israel's region. A strong Palestinian society is not only good for Israel in terms of its security physically, it's good for its security also, if you like, culturally and politically, because it will be able to have a positive impact in terms of democracy in other countries around. So I think the vision is a great vision. Further down the line, we need to be able to move, and it will be good for Israel. I'm not sure how far you'll be able to go, because obviously the Arab world is not by any means a homogeneous world.
Perhaps then one or two closing questions from the middle or the back. I see one hand in the middle.
Wo sind die Mikrofone? Bitte, vielleicht noch einmal die Hand hinauf. Sie wollen die Frage nicht mehr stellen.
Can you raise your hand? You don't want to ask the question?
Ich sehe auch, ja, ganz hinten vielleicht, genau. Wir sehen schlecht wegen der Scheinwerfer.
Perhaps right at the back. It's difficult to see because of the lights.
Thank you. You talked about that Palestinians were the victims of the greatest suffering on ever, and how can you quantify suffering? The Israelis who suffered from the bombings also suffered, and I mean, like he said, it was not in a concentrated manner, but they still suffered. And you say that all avenues were not explored, but how do you intend to bring Hamas on the negotiating table if they have not listened to the pleas of Israel to stop their rockets?
These are very, very good questions. I don't know. Obviously, I'm not a politician, I'm not a military authority, nobody consulted with me and nobody asked for my advice and nobody shared the decisions that were taking place. But I have a feeling that Israel's need to defend itself against enemies from all around, because this was originally the Israel-Arab conflict in a sea of hostility and not just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, has led to an assumption that to be aggressive is the only way to be able to respond to a threat. And therefore I am fearful that because of Israel's needs to protect itself, it is often too quick, even though you would come back to me and say, but there were 8 years of rockets and you still didn't do anything. And that is also a fair comment, but nevertheless I feel, as we have said before, that there could have been ways in which, through a third party, there could have been more exploration with Hamas as to what the possibilities were. I don't know. I only suspect. I wasn't categorical in my comments when I was asked by the moderator. I fear, and I'm fearful of that. I'm fearful that a culture of machoism predominates in our society, and there is too great a willingness to believe that you can resolve problems through force. And I don't think, and I agree totally with my brother Abdul in that regard, that in the end you may get a short-term resolution, but not a long-term resolution. I'm sorry I forgot the first part. Remind me very quickly what the first part of your question was again?
It's just that both Israelis and Palestinians have suffered.
Thank you. Of course, you're absolutely right. For a mother whose child is killed or maimed, it's immoral, it's obscene to try to suggest one suffering is greater than another. But collectively, you can talk of a degree of suffering with regards to proportions amongst the people. And from that point of view, the Palestinians, as indeed also my brother mentioned at the beginning, have been the victims on all sides. They have been exploited by Arab nations. They were cast out. They were under Jordanian occupation. They were under Egyptian occupation. None of these Arab countries treated them well. Today, Palestinians in Lebanon are prohibited from over 52 categories of occupations. Palestinians are persecuted and you don't hear anything about that. Of course, because there are those who may exploit that also to avoid them having to face up to their responsibilities. So the situation of abuse of Palestinians, historically and contemporarily, is overwhelming. And therefore, I think that gives one the right to say that they are the greatest victims of this conflict.
Wir müssen zum Schluss kommen.
Well, we have to close. We've run out of time. I'd like to have one closing sentence from each of you. Then to, if there is one step that can be made, what is it?
I will be happy to give my minute to my brother.
You're a very clever man. Bitte schön.
Well, I'm really glad to be here and to have this discussion. I'm very surprised that the audience is enlightened and is basically following the situation closely, and that is first makes me happy. At the same time, it's a challenge that the world is watching. The world is very much interested in what's happening in a place that's very far away. And that puts, as I said, pressure on us that we must find a way out, that this concern that I can see makes us think we have to find a way out. And I think the way out is not going back to history, is not going back to accusations, is not really through slogans, but through real work on the ground. From our side, and my brother David and all those who believe in peace, we assure you one thing: we are not going to give up. We are not going to accept what politicians dictate on us. We believe that human life is holy regardless of the religion of this human life, and we are dedicating a lot of our efforts and money towards creating facts on the ground, positive facts on the ground, and that's something we assure. I speak on behalf of David and myself. We assure you that this is something that we are doing and will keep doing, and we will increase the efforts and the resources that we are allocating towards this objective.
Ulrike Wohlrab.
I would raise one point we haven't touched upon: the role of religion. And in many regards, religion is being hijacked, it's being used as an instrument. We hear from Christians that they need to represent their interests, the Jews, and similar limited views. I believe it's necessary to emphasize the positive aspects of religion. In that way, all three religions can really contribute to peace, and that would be my wish for the future.
Well,
You don't want to add anything, so...
I only want to agree totally with Pastor Ulrich with regards to her comment. I spend a lot of my time, and some people think I'm crazy, trying to build communication between the religious leaders in the Holy Land. And we have succeeded in creating a council of the religious institutions, of the Sharia courts of Palestine, of the Ministry of Waqf, together with the chief rabbinate of Israel, and the patriarchs and the bishops. And Bishop Munib Yunan, who is the Lutheran Bishop of Jerusalem, I say in honor of my colleague, has played a very important contribution to that. And this council is established for three things: to keep open avenues of communication between the leaders, to fight against defamation and incitement, and to support all initiatives for peace and reconciliation. Because I agree that religion is often the problem, but religion must be the solution, and without the support of religion, I'm not sure we will be able to achieve that.
Dankeschön, David Rosen.
Thank you very much, David Rosen. Well, you've been very patient as an audience. I think that as for the participants and for myself, it was the same for you. One is always a bit dissatisfied after the discussion on the Middle East. There are so many issues we haven't touched upon. We obviously didn't get any simple solutions. I don't think we expected that, but we got some very useful suggestions and ideas. So I'd like to thank the participants, David Rosen, Ulrike Wohlrab, and Abdul. Thank you very much.